Tilea's Troubles, Part 122. The Assault on Miragliano. A Battle Report. When Captain General Lord Alessio had received all his scouts' reports concerning the approaches to the city, it was obvious that no route was safe, but that one, at least, was potentially better than the rest. The taint of necromantic magic had permeated far beyond the city itself, so that, in places, the marsh and moat veritably teemed with animated corpses. Lord Alessio simply chose a way through which avoided what seemed to be the worst of those accursed spots. It wasn't where the flooded moat was the narrowest, nor where the outlying ground was least boggy, but there were gates in the walls there, which was the only absolute necessity. His plan was simple. His army would drag the rafts, as quickly as they could, to the moat's edge, then launch and ride them to the walls. Most rafts would carry ladder-armed companies, but the two heaviest had siege towers, and the next heaviest carried a ram. Lord Alessio was hoping that sheer weight of numbers would allow his army to overwhelm the enemy, which in truth had been part of his strategic planning from the very start of his campaign against the Undead. He deployed most of the missile troops on the left, including his own Portomaggiore handgunners and crossbowmen, the latter commanded by Captain Lupo the Wolf Lorenzo, as well as the Riemann crossbow regiments, both men and dwarfs. He allowed the VMC's handgunner detachments to accompany their pike regiment on the far right, along with their independent handgunner regiment. Having lost all but one cannon on the march hither, and denied artillery reinforcement by the VMC commander's strange decision to send only foot troops to support him, he now placed this last piece on the far left, to play against the gate as best it could, and, should it prove necessary, to fire upon anything monstrous emerging from the foul waters. His intention was that such a weight of shot and bolt on the left would disrupt or destroy any enemy attempting to flank his assaulting troops, either in the moat or the marsh. Surely very little could withstand the combined firepower of over 60 handguns and crossbows, plus a heavy artillery piece. The dwarf warriors, captained by the Kislevite commander of the Riemann Brigade, Captain Soldatovia, were, like every melee regiment, equipped with a raft, and, if necessary, would be available to engage an enemy on the water, while the skirmishing bravi were ordered to protect the gun from anything approaching from the flank or rear. The VMC apprentice wizard, Serafina, added a magical element to that flank, and the Riemann Morite priest, Bendali, also with the dwarven warriors, should bolster the soldiers' resolve in the face of the undead foe. On the right, where his main fighting regiments were placed, with the bigger rafts and the siege tower rafts, there was the re-sanctified Carroccio. This, the general hoped, would lift the soldiers' spirits, by channeling the mystical blessings of Moor, while the more mundane VMC ogres, led by the infamous Ogbut, were to smash through the gate with their raft-mounted ram. Alessio's largest Portomaggiore regiment, the Spears, took position in the very centre of the line. Such was their weight of numbers that he was happy to have them commanded only by their own champion. They would flank the ram, from where they might thwart any attack from the water. Then, of course, should the ram prove capable of smashing through the gates, they would join the ogres to swarm through immediately, crossing from their raft. General Lord Alessio himself was with his Seawolf Guard regiment, atop the siege tower from where he could scrutinise the entire line. Beside him strode the Colossus, taller even than the tower top, and entirely capable, the wizard Lord Hakim had reassured him, of fording the moat waters. To the general's right, the crew of the Carroccio had been ordered to get as close as was safe to the water's edge, so that the holy aura of the relics contained within its chest would remain near enough to the fighting men that they felt its inspiring vigour. The enemy had distributed its strength across the full length of the walls facing the assaulting Alliance army. Ghouls and zombies swarmed on most of the walls, in some cases so numerous that they could not all fit upon the parapet, while the flanking walls contained even more disturbing defenders, nightmarishly ethereal in form. The vampire priest of the Church of Nagash, Biagino, was hidden away inside one of the towers, as were his two necromantic lieutenants. He presumably saw no need to subject himself to the attentions of enemy shooting, although, unlike a Tabino, he had not commanded his regimented warriors to remain hidden behind the walls. Perhaps the defeat he suffered there meant he now thought the tactic was worthless. If it failed to help him previously, why employ it again? Or perhaps he believed that the enemy might become dismayed by the numbers on the walls. Being an alliance force suggested the possibility that any particular part might refuse to fight as hard as the rest. Fell bats awaited behind the far right wall, beneath the cairn wraiths atop the parapet, chittering and flapping their wings in anticipation. The wraiths, in contrast, moved silently. On the far left wall, ghostly manifestations swirled eerily about each other, presenting the living soldiers across the water with an uncanny glimpse of just how tortured an afterlife could await those unlucky souls who fell under the dominion of vampires. An uncanny light shone about them as they danced and wove around each other vigorously, but it was a brightness of such strange origins that it cast no reflection in the waters below. As swirling spirits danced mystically around the crenellations, as if to lure the enemy towards them, elsewhere on the walls, the defenders stood peering and leering over the parapet, their own lurching motions much clumsier. The zombies were almost silent, apart from their effortful gurgling as their ragged throats habitually and unnecessarily dragged air to and from their rotting lights. The ghouls were louder, issuing forth corrupted words as they thought impatiently of the mountain of flesh they would feast upon when the battle was done. Bigino sensed the failure of one of his lieutenants to employ necromantic magic, and so, before the other could wastefully sap the winds of magic further, he cast Invocation of Nehek to summon up more than a score of zombies, thereby bolstering the regiments defending the walls on either side of his tower. Satisfied, and having willed not one of his servants to take so much as a step, he watched as the enemy drew closer. Not all moved, certainly not those with bows or guns, but the dwarfs pushed their raft onwards, as did the large regiments propelling the ram and the siege tower rafts. Several other large regiments stood their ground, for want of an opportunity to advance, what with so many others in the way. The grey-clad Marienberger pikemen of the VMC brigade simply watched from behind. Of the umpteen conjurations attempted by the Alliance Army's magic users, only Wizard Lord Hakim's spell, Shem's Burning Gaze, was successful in harming the foe, causing a good quarter of the spiritos to dissipate from this realm whence they had came. The handgunners were as yet unable to find a target, and of the crossbowmen, only Lupo and his Portomaggiorans found their mark, felling a handful of zombies, unaware that the loss was but a fraction of what had been raised only moments before. When the Remans behind, shooting over the Portomaggiorans' heads, failed to add a single zombie's demise to the tally, they began to wonder what magical blessing was guiding the bolts launched by Lupo's men. Biagino had noticed the small yet surprising number of casualties also, and, with a mental gesture, commanded the cairn wraiths to dismount the wall and await the foe unseen, just in case the enemy's bolts were indeed blessed with some magical power. Once he was satisfied that they had done so, he looked from the window and descried that a swarm of bats had swooped from the marshes to the rear of the enemy's line. They were close to the artillery piece, which pleased him, so he focused his malignantly magical will upon them to make sure that their first action would be to attack the crew. Their arrival reminded him of the zombies who inhabited the marshland. He knew this would be exactly the right moment for them also to arrive at the enemy's rear, before the rafts had been launched to carry the soldiers out of reach. Closing his eyes, he muttered the words of an incantation to call on them, but as the magical current flowed aimless away, he sensed immediately that there were none within reach. Nevertheless, he peered through the window of the dank tower chamber he was hiding in, looking for any sign that might indicate their imminent arrival. Nothing. He cursed angrily, then dismissed his frustration and, along with one of his lieutenants, simply summoned yet more zombies to swell the rank and file of his wall defenders. He was determined not to yield this city easily, or indeed at all, for that would surely be his ruin. With little to shoot at upon the walls, and nothing yet to appear in the moat, the Riemann crossbow regiments, dwarf and human, and Lord Alessio's handgunners, turned to face the swarming bats. More crucially, perhaps, so did the Riemann Bravi swordsmen, ensuring that the bats could not reach the gun except by taking on them. Further along the line, Ogbut's ogres reached the moat, heaved their raft onto it, and mounted it in readiness for the crossing. The magical construct known as the Colossus, guided as ever by its creator, Wizard Lord Hakim, now also began to wade, somewhat tentatively for such a massive creation, into the waters. Seraphina's fireball killed but one single bat amongst the swarm, having veered to one side so that it barely singed the rest. The Morite cleric, Bendali, who had entirely failed to notice the bat's arrival, employed his amulet of coal to send his own fireball to burst into the parapet and wash flames over, killing no less than 10 zombies. His happiness was only slightly marred by the fact that the amulet shattered in the process. Annoyed that he had not thought to do so first, he now cast Mor's touch upon the surviving zombies, weakening them. The Colossus cast Shem's burning gaze on the ghouls, but Biagino was quick enough to dispel it. Lord Hakim tried again where his servant had failed, and this time killed 2 of the enemy. The rest of the ghouls seemed not to care a jot, nor even to notice their comrade's demise. Lupo's crossbowmen, despite their blessed weapons and the enemy's magically induced weakness, now slew less of the zombies than previously, much to their confusion. The gun had yet to fire, having been waiting for the monsters they were told lurked in the moat. Now, however, they decided the bats were a priority, and turned their piece accordingly. They were over-hasty, however, and sent the shot into the dirt. The swarming bats in the rear of the Allies' line now swooped in an arc to attack the smaller of the 2 handgun companies, not the Bravi before the gun. Zanobi, Benedetto and Nofri were in the front rank as the swarm came at them, and the sudden proximity of such fearful foes weakened their legs and churned their stomachs. Those in the company whose pieces were made ready gave fire, but to no particularly noticeable effect. When the bats hit them, they became engulfed in a tangle of fur and leathery wings, then pierced all over by claws and teeth. All 3 were killed, as well as another of their comrades. Those handgunners who survived this initial onslaught failed entirely in their attempts to flee. Indeed, the swarm's progress was barely slowed by the bloody contact, and as the last of the handgunners splashed lifeless into the soggy ground, the bats crashed into another company. It was all so quick that the second company never even fired a single shot. Barely half managed to draw their blades, the rest making do with the butt of their handguns as the swarm hit them. Frustrated that he could see so little through the leaded glass window of the tower chamber, Biagino burst through the door and plunged into the mass of zombies swarming upon the parapet, there to hide amongst them. Having attempted twice to call the zombies of the swamp, without sensing their presence at all, he now knew that wherever they were, it was too far for them to be brought to the field of battle. He sensed his lieutenant's magical conjuring, and guessed it was another attempt to lure one of the leviathans inhabiting the moat, but nothing came of it, and so he himself stared into the water as he wrestled with the winds of magic to make them conform to his own will. He too failed, as the enemy had several wizards, one of whom employed a counterspell to unwind and wash away the winds before they could sufficiently coalesce in the material realm. The apprentice wizard Seraphina was unnerved by all the deaths so close to her, and ran back towards the higher ground in the rear, struggling all along to cross the difficult ground. As the Colossus and the ram raft drew closer to the city walls, the dismounted knights mounted the siege tower. They were commanded by Lord Marcus Portelli, who had been wounded at Urbino. Despite requiring help to climb the ladder, he nevertheless projected a fearlessness which inspired his men, and he looked the very essence of a warrior as he took his place at the front, leaning upon his huge iron-barbed mace. While Father Bendali prayed for more to protect the dwarf warriors, only one wizardly spell successfully pierced the mystical defences mustered by the vampire and his lieutenants. 5 ghouls tumbled from the wall as a banishment took grip upon them. Yet still, as before, the rest showed no sign of caring, nor even noticing. Lupo's crossbowmen slew 5 more zombies, but like the ghouls, the remainder just peered through the crenellations, entirely ignorant of their fellow defenders' second demise. Biagino noticed, however, and in a fit of anger, he ordered the fell bats and the cairn wraiths to burst from the defences onto the moat, from where they could charge at the foe. The wraiths moved ethereally through the very stones to glide eerily and terrifyingly over the water towards the raft carrying the Riemann dwarves, Father Bendali and Captain Soldatovia, while the monstrous bats flew speedily across the full width of the moat towards the handgunners already engaged with their smaller kin. Inside the city, the diminished host of spirits drifted towards the gate tower, while the similarly reduced company of ghouls moved to take the spot on the far left wall the spirits had recently departed. 1 or 2 amongst them seemed somewhat put out at being commanded so to move, having previously been greedily eyeing the approaching foe. When they discovered enemies were also approaching this new wall, they satisfied themselves that they had not been denied their share of flesh meat. Miragliano could now see clearly the approaching dwarves and the enemies crossing further along the moat. If the deadly cairn wraiths made short work of dispatching the dwarves, then it was likely they could move on to one or even more of the other wraths before the enemy reached the walls. So it was, he attempted to conjure a curse to weaken the foe, only to fumble it when momentarily distracted. While several more spells were either foiled or simply failed, including a further attempt to lure the moat-dwelling leviathans, ever more zombies were successfully raised to swell the horde now defending 2 stretches of the wall. The swarming bats quickly sapped the second body of handgunners' will to fight, killing all who fled away as they became mired in the stinking mud. This meant the fell bats could swoop down on a clear run towards the cannon crew. Yet, despite this success, the massive bulk of the enemy lay further along the moat, and so far there had been no hindrance at all to its passage. A large regiment of Portomaggiore spearmen, who had so bravely assaulted the gate at Urbino after it had been blown to pieces by siege master Guccio's petard, recently heavily reinforced with the survivors of several no longer field-worthy companies and regiments, had already boarded a large raft to commence their own crossing. Desperate to avoid a moat-top combat with the nightmarish wraiths, Captain Soldatovia ordered his mercenary dwarves to propel the raft as speedily as possible, even if it endangered the lives of some of those aboard. He was praying they would pass by before the ghastly creatures could sweep around at them. With a sinking heart, the Kislevite captain recognised their progress was just too slow. Clutching his blade tight, he turned to look at the foe, racking his brains at how he might survive the inevitable encounter, when suddenly 4 of the foul spirits disappeared, as a storm of bolts came whistling through the air from Lupo's crossbowmen. This confused him, for such mundane missiles would not normally be expected to harm ethereal beings. Serafina had halted her flight, and was the first wizard to notice the wraiths. She failed, however, in her subsequent attempt to manifest fireballs to hurl at them. That failure, however, had been perceived by her master, the wizard Lord Johannes Dieter, who was close to the Carroccio. When he looked through the leafless trees to see what Serafina had been attempting to harm, he too saw the wraiths. Being well versed in the art of fire magic, he had immediately conjured a ruinous blessing upon Lupo's crossbowmen, which is why their bolts carried just enough magic to sting the foe, despite their ghostly nature. And sting they did, enough to slay more than half. An enchanted round shot was also blasted at the wraiths, but it missed and instead crunched into the wall beyond, while the rest of the Allies' crossbowmen brought down merely a handful of bats and zombies. Even the gunners on the Carroccio blasted their swivels at the wall, but again with little effect. The ogres, however, had already reached the gate, and had begun swinging the ram to crash repeatedly into the iron-bound, anciently hard oak. They did not yet know that they were going to be there a long time, for the gate was strong. The last 2 wraiths now did exactly what Soldatovia feared, and tore into the exposed flank of the dwarfs on the raft. The raft tipped precariously to one side, as Soldatovia, clad head to toe in armour, knew there was little he could do but pray for his own soul. The Kislevite veteran, the portly priest Bendali, and each and every dwarf upon the raft would be dead or dying within moments, most taking only as long as it took for the air to run out in their lungs as they fell like stones into the stagnant but deep moat water. The fell bat swooped gracefully to smash into the artillerist Captain Hans Weidmuller and his cannon crew. The crew died quickly, while Hans put up a little more of a fight. Bleeding from his wounds, he turned to flee, pursued by the unthinking creatures, and died from their attentions. His demise was unwitnessed by any in the Allied army. While the swirling spirits occupied the gate tower, the bat swarm hove around and flew towards the rear of the dwarf crossbowmen. Miragliano concentrated wholly upon his magical efforts and summoned up nigh upon a score more zombies to further swell those on and behind the walls. He even returned a cairn wraith into the mortal realm. Beyond these successes, however, nothing he nor his lieutenants tried proved effective, so that still no Leviathan could be hailed to attack the multitude of enemies now teeming precariously upon the moat. As the Allies all drew ever closer to the walls, some rafts moving quicker than others, Serafina, having found an inner peace despite the terrors of the marsh, sent a streaming blast of fireballs into the wraiths. burned away all trace of them from the waking world. This left only the bats, large and small, outside the walls, caught up with harassing the crossbowmen at the far left of the Allied line. There was nothing now to slow the massed rank and file in their journey to the walls. As the living wizards cast magical blessings on the large regiments, Lupo directed his crossbowmen to slay more and more of the zombies, while Lord Marcus drew ever closer to the wall, and the VMC Pike Regiment crowded onto their raft behind, waiting their time to climb the siege tower's ladders and mount the walls. The Captain-General, Lord Alessio, had already reached the far left wall, and immediately set about assaulting the ghouls defending it. In spite of being fully armoured, he leapt from the platform top of the siege tower to crash into the foul creatures massed on the parapet, the magical glare of his shield dazzling and paining the ghouls' eyes. His men followed quickly and obediently, and the slaughter was great, with 3 of the sea-wolves falling, but many, many more ghouls. If they had not already suffered injuries to magical attacks, the foul flesh-eaters might have delayed the Portomaggiore soldiers a little longer, but they simply did not have the numbers. Lord Alessio quickly took full possession of the wall. Despite the moat, despite the marsh, the living were already in the city. As the bat swarms swooped between the crossbow regiments, the fell bats also careened around at the rear, looking for another company to attack. Miragliano cursed, and cursed again, as neither he nor his lieutenants could summon the Leviathans, nor could they manifest any other magic to thwart the enemy. He heard the enemy's cheers and knew that they must have taken at least one wall, and, despite having raised a veritable host of zombies to defend the other 2 stretches, he knew full well that they could only ever buy him time, not victory. The foe was too numerous, and the force left to him entirely insufficient to the task of holding the city. Suddenly he felt an etheric heat, and strained to look down into the yard. The Colossus was obviously able to see over the walls, and had burned away almost all the spirits with a magical gaze, leaving but a handful hidden beneath the stone arch. Out beyond the moat, the bats had concentrated their last assault on the dwarven crossbows, but found them to be a much harder challenge than the handgunners and cannon crew. Meanwhile, Lord Alessio had already led his men from the first wall through the tower and on to the next, before the dismounted knights could mount it from their own siege tower. There, Alessio and his men lay furiously into the first large body of zombies, finding the work a tiring but simple act of butchery. Lord Marcus could only watch as his master hacked and slashed through the stinking mass of rotten flesh, and the Portomaggiorans' elite soldiers moved across the wall right in front of him. It was clear the city was lost. Every one of Miragliano's cards had been played. The bumpy yield he had expected from the corpse-filled, fetid marsh and moat had proved entirely disappointing. He had been chased from the very heart of Tilea all the way to Miragliano. Now he knew that if he was to unlive any longer, he must flee yet again, and right now, before the enemy could reach him. And flee he did. He knew not whether he would go to the marsh or the mountains, but he did not have time to ponder the matter. The last of the vampire's possessions, the once great city of Miragliano, had finally fallen. And so the great war against the undead had ended.